Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lane Russell, and you're watching Midnight. It's good to see you all again after so long a time. It's been a while since my last video, and I've shown my videos to a couple of people, and they have a couple of questions for me, like, why do you talk like that? Well, I figure now's a good time as any to tell you about it. You can probably hear one of the reasons I talk like that snoring in the background right now. I have people who live with me here, and I talk quietly, but clearly so as not to disturb them. Of course, it comes out sounding stilted and, kind of snooty sounding, but the sleeper over there, he's got headphones in, so we shouldn't be able to bother him. Standard disclaimer: everything I'm telling you is my own opinion. I'm not sponsored by anybody. Nobody's paying my bills. Nobody's paying me to say what I say, in other words. Today I want to address the Second Amendment. Utah Senator Orrin Hatch has called the right to keep and bear arms that one most valued by free men, and I agree. Freedom of speech is useless unless you have something to back it up with. Our right is recognized in the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which reads as follows: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, to me, that's a very simple, straightforward straightforward declaration of the rights of the individual American to own and carry weapons. There is much confusion, however, as to the interpretation of this amendment. There is a vocal contingent on the left who insists that the well-regulated militia clause means that citizens are only supposed to be armed if called up for militia duty. No less august a personage than former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens has declared that the Second Amendment should be modified to read that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed only when serving in a militia. I myself have been accused of ignoring the well-regulated militia clause in the Second Amendment. Today I hope to dispel once and for all the confusion over the meaning of the Second Amendment, to show the uncertainty over interpretation is unnecessary and perhaps disingenuous. After reading this book, I'm going to hold it up for you, The Second Amendment Primer by Les Adams, I hope to show conclusively that the framers of the Constitution meant unequivocally and without ambiguity that the general population were to be armed. The militia clause was included to support this intent. Now, we as a country have lost touch with our origins, and that was pretty much inevitable. Rome, after all, began as a monarchy, then became a republic, then an empire. It's unlikely that Romans in the late imperial era would have cared much about the kings of early Rome. Nevertheless, it is inexcusable in this day and age, when the entire accumulated knowledge of humanity fits into our phones, to be continually and persistently, to be continually and persistently ignorant of the things that affect our daily life, chief among these being the Constitution and its amendments. Fortunately, Les Adams has done quite a bit of the work for us. He traces the idea of a free and armed citizenry from the most unlikely location of ancient China to Philadelphia in 1776. He examines the writings of English writers, philosophers, and jurists that would have formed such a large part of the founders' education. The rights of the armed citizenry were a uniquely British idea, sprung from the apparent circumstances of intermittent invasions and the need to mobilize from time to time for war. Neighboring countries usually hired armies of foreign mercenaries, which both emptied the royal coffers quickly and made it easier for the king to suppress his subjects. England, by contrast, required that every man above 16 who was able to carry arms both do so and be trained in their use. It was forbidden to be without arms or armor, and someone who had no weapons in his home could be subject to fines or even imprisonment. Armed forces in England were divided into three main groups. There were the housecarls, or what we would call today a standing army. There was the select fyrd, or paid groups of part-time semi-professional noblemen and soldiers, often mercenaries. And the great fyrd, all men between 16 and 60 years of age who could be conscripted for military service or national defense. This great fyrd would be the forerunner of the colonial militia. According to Anglo-Saxon law, freemen were not to be disarmed, and were in fact required to have in their houses armor, pike, sword, bow and arrows, whatever they could obtain and use. In fact, even giving your weapons away was seen as a violation of law. Because of this three-tiered system, England had no standing army until the late 17th century. Law enforcement and national defense were everyone's responsibility. Even after the Reformation, in which Catholicism lost prominence to the Anglican Church and Catholics were looked upon with great suspicion, they were allowed to keep weapons for self-defense, though they were forbidden to stockpile. How England came to be the disarmed and powerless citizenry they are today, starting with the reign of Charles II and continuing to present times, is not what I'm here to examine. Rather, I demonstrate that in the tradition that the founders inherited from England, the right to be armed was a natural right that all free Englishmen, exercised freely. The Constitution's framers were thoroughly educated in the English way. They knew how to think, they knew how to say in plain English what they meant to say, and they meant everything that they said. We know that they declared the right of the people to keep and bear arms would not be infringed. We know that they justify this by saying a well-regulated militia was necessary for the security of a free state. So when they said this, what did they really mean? Did they mean that every free citizen was to have free and unrestricted access to firearms? Well, yes, absolutely this is what they meant. The people, whose right to keep and bear would not be infringed, is the same we, the people of the United States, referenced in the preamble. We may know this by the prolific and unambiguous writings they left on the subject. Patrick Henry of Give Me or Liberty or Give Me Death fame wrote, "The great object is that every man be armed. Every man who is able may have a gun." Samuel Adams, "And that the said Constitution be never construed to infringe the just liberty of the press or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms." Alexander Hamilton, "Little more can be reasonably aimed at with respects to the people at large than to have them properly armed and equipped." Thomas Jefferson, "No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms." William Rawle, "No clause of the Constitution could by any rule of construction be conceived to give Congress a power to disarm the people." But perhaps the most powerful and instructive words in this matter of the Second Amendment come from George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, when he says, "Who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, except a few public officers." A well-regulated militia. That clause was used by the framers to justify the need for a general population armed and proficient with the most modern weaponry a man could afford on his own, for his defense of self against criminal or animal, for defense of country against foreign invasion, and for defense of liberty against an overreaching, overambitious federal government. Opponents of the Second Amendment, leftists, Democrats, Soros-funded initiatives, Handgun Control Incorporated, make pretensions to legitimacy by arguing that the Second Amendment is only a collective right exercised by the National Guard in performance of their duties. They are all lying. It is utterly ridiculous to ask us to believe that the rights guaranteed to the people mean the people individually in the First Amendment, the people in a collective sense to the Second Amendment, then right back to the people individually in the Third through Fifth Amendments. The founders knew what they wanted to say. They knew how to say it, and they said it in English as plain as the 18th century allowed. Every law-abiding citizen of this republic has the innate God-given right to own firearms, and that right shall not be infringed. Now, until 1865, only the Congress was restrained from infringing on the individual rights of own and carry, but with the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1866, it was enacted that the states were also prohibited from infringing on the rights of citizens to be armed. Senator Jacob Merritt Howard of Michigan explained that the intent of the first section of the 14th Amendment was to restrain the individual states from infringing the personal rights and securities, or the personal rights guaranteed and secured by the first 8 amendments to the Constitution, such as the freedom of speech and the press, the right of people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances, a right appertaining to each and all the people, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to be exempted from quartering of soldiers in a house without the consent of the owner, the right to be exempt from unreasonable searches and seizures. The great object of the first section of this amendment is therefore to restrain the power of the states and compel them at all times to respect these great fundamental guarantees. At no point did anyone move to exempt the Second Amendment from those rights and guarantees during ratification. Indeed, with a Congress consisting mainly of Republicans at that time, who were all too keenly aware of efforts by Southern Democrats to disarm and terrorize newly freed black slaves, there can be no doubt that they intended the Second Amendment to be, as with the rest of the first state, an individual, personal right, which both the state and federal governments were legally compelled to respect. So we see that the founders intended the people to be armed, and the Republican Congress of 1866 intended all black citizens to be armed. And here we are in 2014. We have groups of well-funded, lollygagging, duplicitous, cowardly fabulists pretending that their assault on your rights to own and carry are all about public safety or controlling crime or protecting the children, anything other than disarming you. That's because if they told you the truth, that they want you disarmed and at the mercy of criminals, they would never get elected. If they told you that they want to be the only help you have in the face of criminal oppression, so that you won't resist when the state starts to oppress you, you would never vote for them. When they tell you that only the National Guard is supposed to have weapons, they're lying. When they say that the Second Amendment is only a collective right, they're lying. When they say no one wants to take your guns, they are lying. They are bound by the Constitution to safeguard our human rights, and one of those rights is the right to carry weapons. They are bound not to infringe that right by the Bill of Rights at the federal level and the 14th Amendment at the state level. It's time to hold these clowns responsible. Call your mayor. Call the governor. Call your senators and congressmen. Call the president, and call up that despicable sleazeball of an Attorney General, Eric Holder. Call them and tell them that shall not be infringed means what it says, that you are we the people, and if they don't straighten up, they'll be dealing with an angry electorate come election day. You've been watching Midnight. I'm Lane Russell.